Well, Milana Marsenich lives in northwest Montana near Flathead Lake at the base of the beautiful Mission Mountains.
We can't hear you.
Okay. Milana Marsenich lives in northwest Montana near Flathead Lake at the base of the beautiful Mission Mountains. She enjoys quick access to the mountains and has spent many hours hiking the wilderness trails with friends and dogs. For the past 20 years, she has worked as a mental health therapist in a variety of settings. As a natural listener and as a therapist, she has witnessed amazing generosity and courage in others. She first witnessed this in her hometown of Butte, Montana, a mining town with a rich history and the setting for Copper Sky, her first novel. She has a short story included in the Montana Quarterly book, Montana, Warts and All. She has 3 published novels, Copper Sky, The Swan Keeper, and Beautiful Ghost, and 1 popular history nonfiction book, Idaho Madams, which she is presenting here. Alrighty, folks, take it away.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure. We're both thrilled. I think I speak for both of us on that. So one of the things we were going to talk about first is just, why we, and so Idaho Madams, it's, a little bit of an unusual topic maybe, but I had written my first novel, Copper Sky, it's fiction, but it has a prostitute in it. And then I was trying to figure out why would someone choose such a dangerous lifestyle? And I tried to imagine why that would be. And so when Far Country Press wanted people to write some of they have a whole Madam series, when they were looking for people to write one, I thought, this is an opportunity for me. I can really see why women, chose dangerous situations and dangerous lifestyles. And it turns out I wasn't that far off base. There is a lot of hardship and a lot of heartache in what drives people into prostitution and then into the madams business. And in my book takes place in the early 1800s or late 1800s, early 1900s. And it was a time when women didn't have many choices. They didn't have many safety nets. They could end up in poverty and stranded or, in abusive situations. And so most of them actually chose to go into the sex trade. There are some stories in the early West that they didn't choose, but this is primarily about the women that chose that as a profession. And it wasn't always easy, and it was a lot of times very depressing, and women ended up drug addicted and suicidal, and the madams were the people that had to take care of all of that. And so, when finding the research, being a fiction writer, I hadn't written a book that I had to research other than, to find the facts that I could alter to fit my story, which was, just a luxury I didn't understand until I started trying to research Idaho Madams, because it's not only researching it, but it's researching facts that are elusive and mostly non-existent. No one wrote autobiographies. They didn't write biographies about these women. Most of what I found was, there's a few madams that have been well written about in Idaho, but many of them the facts that I found were in crime reports, and obituaries sometimes, not even that sometimes.
The mic is slow.
Is it work? Oh, it's the battery's low. Can we use yours? Sure.
Yeah, and I'll take that. I will just go ahead and swap.
Okay, is it working? Okay, so, crime reports, and I was lucky. I went to the library and I found a couple of dissertations that were written by women, and surprisingly to me, it was feminist literature is where I found most of the information. So Cynthia Powell wrote a book called Beyond Molly Bedam, and Molly Bedam is one of Idaho's well-known madams. And Joanne Russell also wrote a dissertation called A Necessary Evil. And so Molly Bedam takes place in northern Idaho, and Necessary Evil, she talks about the Madams in southern Idaho around Boise. So it was a challenge to find the facts, and then it was a challenge to write something that neither glorified prostitution nor vilified it. I wanted to write something that was respectful and showed that these women were real human beings, you know, with real tough choices. And so I'll just read a little passage of what I learned here, and then I'll pass it over to Marga. So Idaho has a few well-known madams, such as Molly Badam, Peg Leg Annie, and Diamond Tooth Lil. I was able to find stories and anecdotes about these women and their personal lives. Many of the others left behind nothing but bare census records and arrest reports. Yet they were women trying to make it in the wild, rough, uncivilized West. Women with stories held close to their hearts. Some looked for adventure. Some took care of siblings, children, and husbands. Some put their siblings through school. Some simply tried to survive. Many madams and prostitutes left homes that they could never return to. They changed their names so as not to bring shame on their families. They had children and husbands. They had dreams. They wanted land, homes, stability, autonomy, and safety. They were women of courage and desperation, women of love and loss. Women who bled when cut, like you and me. So, you know, they had tough choices, but they also had dreams, and they had a lot of heart and a lot of courage.
Hi.
Okay.
Thank you for being here. Oh. How's that sound? Okay. Well, Far Country approached me about whether I would like to write a book, and there was an idea in the back of my mind. I've always been interested in how do you stand up in really controversial times and take a stance, and you're just an ordinary sort of regular person, and you're going to take a lot of grief for what you do. And some of the people in my book, we're not just talking about a momentary standing up for courage, but when they stood up, it was an effort that went on for years. One of the people I'm going to read about, a passage from, she's more well-known than the other people in my book, Elouise Cobell, but when I started looking into her life, there were things I discovered that were, I felt most Montanans probably didn't know. My book deals with 10 unsung heroes. Montana Grit, 10 unsung heroes who dared to make a difference. 5 of them happen to be women, so that's my focus. And I'm probably only going to talk about 2 today and possibly 3, depending on time. But I thought I'd introduce you to all of them. There was suffragist Hazel Hunkins, who grew up in Billings and was a leading suffragist in the country in World War I, and I feel most Montanans and most Americans probably don't know anything about her, but she was on the front pages of major newspapers throughout the country during World War I. Crow nurse and advocate Susie Walking Bear Yellowtail. Once again, I don't think most people know her, but she was the first Crow nurse, RN, and she took major stances against involuntary sterilization of Native women and was herself sterilized without being informed. Black nurse and civil rights advocate Octavia Bridgewater, who was born in Helena. She was the daughter of a former slave and a Buffalo soldier. She wound up being she was part of a very small group of black nurses allowed to serve during World War II in the Army Corps of Nurses. Accountant and seeker of justice Elouise Cobell, who I'll talk about in a little while. And then journalist Minnie Two Shoes, who was a Assiniboine Sioux, grew up in the Fort Peck Reservation, was a, very daring, hilarious at times, journalist, and was very involved with the AIM movement, and took a lead role in helping bring two murderers to justice who had murdered a woman named Annie Mae Aquash. So my reading, I thought would give kind of an overview of the book and why I thought these people were important. And it's called The Making of a Hero. I think I'll wear these. Easier. Did you know that in 1917, months after the United States declared war on Germany, a mob of citizens marched through the streets of Lewistown, Montana, yanked German textbooks out of the school library, and burned them in a bonfire? In small towns and cities across Montana in the country, a furor of nationalism turned citizens against one another. Near Glendive, a self-proclaimed super patriots group nearly lynched a minister, and in Forsyth, a mob turned on a well-respected judge. U.S. military veterans, teachers, and ministers were publicly accused of being traitors, humiliated, forced to kiss the flag, and in some cases imprisoned or almost lynched. I first learned of these events while researching this book. These were not the scenes from Montana or American history I'd grown up with. I was stunned, I was also fascinated, and wanted to learn more. Three of the people you meet in this book, Judge Charles L. Crum, Judge George M. Borquin, and Minister John M. France, all faced mobs during that era. Like the other people featured in this book, they had to make decisions about which side they were on. Would they join the crowd, or would they hold to higher principles? Some found guidance in their love and respect for the Constitution, others in their faith. World War I was also the time that drew the fiery and fascinating Hazel Hunkins of Billings into activism. She dreamed of being a chemist, earned a college degree in chemistry, and then learned that no employer would hire a woman. Door after door slammed in her face. While some folks might have grown bitter, Hunkins took rejection as a call to action. This well-dressed, well-educated young woman with an engaging smile was known to scale the White House fence during some of her more flamboyant suffrage protests. No mean feat, considering she was wearing an ankle-length dress. Never heard of her, neither had I. Nor did I know much of anything about Robert Yellowtail, Susie Walking Deer Yellowtail, Elouise Cobell, and Minnie Two Shoes. Born on 3 different reservations in Montana, they each grew up facing what seemed insurmountable odds. All at some level grappled with the theft of their tribe's lands, resources, and power. All of them gathered their inner strength and confronted the overwhelming power and often indifference of the U.S. government. And 2 of the unsung heroes I've gotten to know during my research, Humphrey and Octavia Bridgewater, faced racism and segregation in their everyday lives and in pursuit of their livelihoods. A boycott against the Chinese in Butte was strangling Humphrey's once successful business. And Octavia Bridgewater was drawn to a career in nursing, but Montana hospitals would not hire blacks. As I dug into the research for this book, I was struck by the fact that such strong-willed, independent, and courageous people were largely ignored by history books. Despite their grit and determination, their stories weren't widely known. I began to think of these men and women as Montana's hidden unsung heroes, but that they need not remain so. Their stories are fascinating and compelling, no less today than in their time, and they provide valuable insights into how a person faces tragedies, systemic obstacles, or major disappointments, how a person can endure, how one person can stand against fear and anger and ignorance. They are heroes because their choices and actions required courage, and they toiled not just for themselves, but for the good of all. They didn't take the easy way out.
When talking about madams, you know, they were entrepreneurs, and they provided a sustainable wage, which was something that wasn't really possible for women, most women in the 1800s. The respectable professions like teaching and even seamstresses, they just didn't earn enough to make a living So a lot of women would go to work as a seamstress or at a factory and work long, long hours and still end up in the sex trade. So what the madams did was they provided safety. They taught women how to, check for diseases, how to charm men. They taught them how to get along with each other. They provided home and food for them. And so it's, and then, they watched for drug addictions and suicidal tendencies. And if they didn't catch them and the woman committed suicide, they very often paid for their funerals because they would contact the next of kin, and the next of kin wasn't there. They just didn't respond. And a lot of women changed their names to keep their to keep shame from being, kind of rained down on their families. So the person I'm going to read about first is Molly Badam, and she came from Ireland, and she just had a heart full of courage, and she was an adventurer, and she really wanted to see the world. And she got to New York, and she was Irish, and they didn't want to hire the Irish. Irish need not apply were signs everywhere. And so she did finally get a job in a saloon, and then she fell in love with a guy who was a gambler and a swindler and had a trust fund that his father pulled as soon as he knew that he had married beneath him. And so then he talked her into prostitution because he said things were dangerous, and he owed all these people money and they were going to hurt him and hurt her, and she she didn't want to. She was raised Catholic, but then she gave in to him, and eventually she lost all respect for him, and then she left on her own. And so she had been traveling the West, and her name was Maggie Hall Burden initially. So in 1884, Molly Burden took a train to Thompson Falls, Montana from Deadwood, South Dakota. She was 30 years old, 5 feet, 6 inches tall, with stunning blue eyes, long blonde hair, and a lovely figure. In Thompson Falls, she bought a black stallion and joined a pack train of heroes and of horses and mules headed west. The pack train set off on the full day's trip across a 7,000-foot pass through the rugged mountain terrain to Murray. But an unexpected blizzard swept in, burying the mountains. Nearing the top of the pass, Molly noticed a woman on foot carrying a small child on her back. The child was maybe 2 or 3 years old. The wind blew ferociously against them, turning their cheeks red, and in the deep snow, the woman was struggling to keep up with the others. Molly pulled her horse aside, dismounted, and offered assistance to the woman and child. A passing packer asked if he could help. Molly gave him clear instructions. Get off your horse, help the woman up on my saddle. Then Molly remounted her horse, and the packer handed the child up to her. They rode like that as the blizzard worsened. The woman and child wore light clothing not suitable for winter. And Molly knew they wouldn't survive the night like that. When they came upon a ramshackle shelter, she stopped, helped the woman and child inside, and covered them with her fur coat. She told the members of the pack train to go on without them. They would catch up in the morning. Molly and the mother and child spent the night huddled close together for warmth until the blizzard passed. No one expected to see them alive again. Word of Molly and her courage reached Murray that night as the others pulled into town. The residents prepared a search party for morning, expecting to go back up the pass and retrieve 3 frozen corpses. In the morning, Molly and her companions crossed the mountains to Idaho, and on the black stallion galloped into Murray together. The delighted townspeople filled the streets to greet them. Molly ordered food and shelter for the woman and the child, and paid the bill, earning an instant admiration and a hero's welcome. She had likely saved their lives. A man named Phil O'Rourke helped them off of her horse. He introduced himself and asked her name. She told her that her name was Molly Burden. He laughed because he didn't really understand with her Irish brogue and called her Molly Badam. Molly liked it and the name stuck. O'Rourke and Molly remained friends until the end of her life. She liked his laugh and kindness. For the first time in a long time, Molly felt like she had come home. Molly was born Maggie Hall in Dublin, Ireland on December 6, 1853, to a Protestant father and a Catholic mother. She was raised Irish Catholic and was well educated, able to recite Shakespeare, Milton, and Dante. She was funny and lighthearted and made friends easily. Her parents doted on her. They taught her to be kind to others, to help the sick, feed the needy, and above all, love the Lord. These were lessons Maggie never forgot. She lived by them until the day she died.
I'm going to read about Elouise Cobell. Although she's better known, I find her story very compelling. Elouise Cobell was the treasurer of the Blackfeet tribe. In 1996, Cobell filed a class action lawsuit known as Cobell versus Babbitt to prove that the U.S. government had plundered the wealth of American Indians, charging the government with mismanaging more than $100 billion in oil, timber, grazing, and other royalties. Her fight persisted for 13 and a half years, involved 3,600 court filings, 220 days of trial, 80 published court decisions, and 10 appeals. The name of the lawsuit changed 4 times over the years, reflecting 3 different administrations and their secretaries of interior: Cobell versus Babbitt, Cobell versus Norton, Cobell versus Kempthorne, and Cobell versus Salazar. Growing up in the Blackfeet reservation, she lived, her family home was a ranch 30 miles southeast of Browning. Her father served on the tribal council and was also a tribal stock inspector, making him a trusted tribal leader whom people turned to with their troubles. She grew up hearing their stories and those of her ancestors. Cobell was the granddaughter of the famous Blackfeet leader, Mountain Chief, who after the 1870 Baker massacre of Blackfeet on the Marias River had refused any further compromise with the U.S. government. Cobell's father also told her of how the U.S. government starved her tribe during the starvation winter of 1883-84. Indian agent John Young had made sure that the Blackfeet couldn't leave the reservation, recounted Cobell in an interview. He would not allow Indian people to hunt or carry arms because the government wanted them to be dependent on the Indian agent. And so people just hung around and waited for their rations. The rations were diverted and black marketed, and the women and children and men had to stay confined without any means to hunt. As a result, 500 Blackfeet Indians starved to death, and the government just dug a big open pit graves and threw them in and covered it up. In Cobell's daily travels along U.S. Highway 89, which runs through the Blackfeet Nation, she passed by their sacred burial site, Ghost Ridge, and the historical marker. It spurred her to persist with the lawsuit even when she was exhausted. I drive this road every single day, and some days I feel really, really tired of fighting this lawsuit against the United States government. And all I have to do is look up to the west and see Ghost Ridge and remember all the people that starved to death for injustice. And so then it becomes their fight. It becomes the fight of the people of Ghost Ridge that we are trying to hold the United States accountable for. Other stories Elouise heard were of missing money and the plight of tribal members, unable to get the trust monies that were owed them by the federal government. The story that moved Cobell the most was that of her aunt, who needed her lease money to pay for medical care for her sick husband. It was a harsh winter, and they traveled 30 miles through snow in a horse and buggy to get to the agency office, but they wouldn't let them in, Cobell recalled in an interview. They waited outside in freezing cold weather all day. At the end of the day, the agency told them, "Come back tomorrow." The next day, they waited again, and at the end of the day, the agency told them, "Go home." Their check finally came in the spring. My aunt died without ever seeing justice, and her husband died from lack of medical care.
When I read that story, it just brought me to tears. You know, I had told my family earlier today, you know, I don't know if I can do this without crying because the stories are so touching and there's so much courage in them and there's so much heart in them that you know, it definitely touches me. And so, you know, we're not so much different in the sense that there are some unsung heroes here, and that is, I think it's always touching when you bring that to light. So I wanted to talk a little bit about resilience and character of the Madams. Molly Badam, who I just read a little bit about, if you read further into her story, when she was about 32, so she was 30 when she went to Murray, Idaho. So when she was 32, a man rode a horse into town, went into a bar, ordered a drink, and fell over dead. It turns out he had chicken pox. And so she rallied the town because everybody kind of hid away, but she rallied the town to take care of each other. And then she died 2 years later of tuberculosis because she just kept working. She wouldn't stop trying to help people. So even though many people died, most likely some people were saved by her care and her tenacity. She took care of miners that were sick with yellow fever. She tried to help people get their money back if their money went missing. You know, miners would be up in the hills for a year and come in with their poke of gold, and it would go missing, and she would work to get it back. So she really had a lot of resilience, and she had a lot of character. Peg Leg Annie, she was in Rocky Bar in Atlanta, and she stayed with her friend. She had houses in both towns, and so one spring actually, she walked across the pass from Atlanta to Rocky Bar, and a storm came in, and her friend Dutch M was with her, and Dutch M didn't have very warm clothes, so when the storm came in, Peg Leg Annie tried to, gave her some of her clothes and tried to keep her warm with her body, and Dutch M didn't make it, but Peg Leg Annie did, but she lost both of her legs. And then Diamond Tooth Lil, I'll read a little bit about her resilience and her character. It'll say it right here, and you can see where she starts and where she ends. I think she's especially good to kind of read about character and resilience because, Molly Badam died when she was 34, but Peg Leg Annie died when she was like in her 70s, and I think Diamond Tooth Lil died when she was in her 90s. So, they all had to find a new way after the turn of the century when prostitution and being a madam became so much more dangerous because it went, instead of being under the auspices of the women, it went to the men and the disreputable men, so it was way more dangerous and there was a lot more violence involved. This was one of the things I didn't realize is when the madams were in charge of the sex industry, the women were treated as employees, but when the men were in charge, the pimps were in charge of the sex industry, they were treated as commodity. They were owned and, there was a lot of violence involved. So I'll read a little bit from Diamond Tooth Lil. As best as can be determined through the pages of time, the stories in this book are true, but the truth is difficult with Diamond Tooth Lil. Sorry. She was first and foremost an entertainer, singer, dancer, and storyteller. Having a gift for language, she told stories that suited her wherever she found a receptive ear, and she continued to tell them as long as someone would listen. She loved the attention, and she could talk herself out of rough spots and into desired positions. If receptiveness was lacking, she'd find a way to engage her listener and generate genuine interest. Her livelihood and life depended on it. The most money I ever made, she told a reporter when talking about singing at Tex Rickard's Northern Saloon in Goldfield, Nevada, was $275 a week. No, make that $300. It sounds better. According to Joanne Russell in her dissertation, A Necessary Evil, Lil said she made $100,000 during her time in Boise City. She carried a gun, smoked cigars, and had a diamond embedded in one of her incisors, setting the stage for a good story to evolve. But the most brilliant story that Diamond Tooth Lil ever told was the one she must have told herself. See, that's what I mean. But the most brilliant story Diamond Tooth Lil ever told was the one she must have told herself, that she would be okay in a cruel world, a world that sent her father into alcoholism, violence, and eventually suicide, a world that gave her a depressed mother and a brutal stepfather, a world that started with hunger and poverty, a world that stole a young brother whose death she blamed on herself, a world in which her husband left her, a 14-year-old, stranded hundreds of miles from home. It was a home she would not return to. Clever, determined, and creative, Lil took up the mantles of adventurer, entertainer, traveler, and businesswoman as they suited her. At a young age, she was the belle of the ball and the life of the party. She would fight and she would survive beyond the predictions of others. This was a good story. I'm just going to read at the very end of her part, because she did go on to be a madam and ran several houses, and she went through several states, but it ended up in Boise. But so she died at 89, right? So a reporter once asked Lil, what would she change if she could live again? Nothing, was her spirited answer. I know I've outlived my time. So many of the people I knew have passed. The Barbary Coast is no more. I understand the old Mitzpah Hotel and filling station are all that's left in Goldfield. Silver City is a ghost town, but I have my memories and they keep me going, and they're all happy ones. So it was Diamond Tooth Lil's story to tell, and she told it well.
For my second person, I'm going to talk about suffragist Hazel Hunkins. The title is Designed for Strife. A brief biography of Hazel Hunkins could be bookended by two events: chaining herself to the front gates of the White House in 1917, and then 60 years later in 1977, being honored in the Rose Garden by President Jimmy Carter for her tireless efforts to support women's rights. At the time she met President Carter, she was believed to be the last living suffragist. She told him, "I don't know if I'm the last, but if I'm not the last, I'm certainly the noisiest." Despite all the noise she made, most Montanans knew very little about Hunkins and her radical political activities until fairly recently. And Kevin Kustra in Billings is instrumental in getting her story more well-known. She was born in Aspen, Colorado. She moved to Billings in 1903 as a teenager, and she attended Billings High School, where she excelled academically. She completed high school in 3 years and was the 1908 class valedictorian. In the yearbook, it shows her as a member of she's the only woman on the debating team, and she is a member of the women's basketball team. But perhaps there was an inkling of the idealist she was. The Billings Gazette noted that Hunkins presented a speech by Jean Valjean from Les Mis, winning a preliminary declamation contest during her senior year and going on to compete in Missoula. In her brief 3-year high school career, Hunkins racked up a trifecta of accomplishments in addition to being valedictorian, voted by her classmates as most popular, second smartest, and third most conceited. So she attended Vassar, she earned a degree in chemistry, and all she wanted to do was work as a chemist. She had to return to Billings in 1916 when her mom was sick, so she helped nurse her mother, and she was applying for chemistry jobs. She received numerous rejections, saying that they would not hire her because she was a woman. She starts a local chapter of the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage group. And then Alice Paul, a leading suffragist, recruits her. And she becomes, because of her passionate convictions, Hunkins was among the first women to volunteer with the Silent Sentinels, a group of suffragists who, beginning in January 1917, stood in silence while picketing outside the White House with the intent of challenging and embarrassing President Wilson to support the suffrage amendment. They carried banners that read, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And they unfurled a huge banner in front of the White House stating, "President Wilson is deceiving the world when he appears as the prophet of democracy. President Wilson has opposed those who demand democracy for this country. He's responsible for the disenfranchisement of millions of Americans. We in America know this. The world will find him out." Years later, she would describe the picketing experience as hell. Not only would they stand shivering in snow and rain, and later in blistering heat, but they faced rude and abusive treatment at times, particularly after Congress declared war on Germany in April 1917. Some accused the suffragists of being unpatriotic and traitors and attacked them both verbally and physically. In a 1977 interview, she recalled being clubbed by police, pelted with eggs by a crowd when she spoke in Lafayette Square across from the White House. And in another interview, she recalled, "The crowds were very unfriendly. We used to grit our teeth for the insults when the civil servants came out of work at 4 p.m. Dirty bitches, what are you doing here?" they would shout. Sometimes it was even worse than that. So Hazel is appearing on the front page of a number of newspapers during various arrests. In 1917, she was arrested and sentenced to the Occoquan workhouse. And there, it should be explained that Alice Paul had been arrested shortly before that and had been put in a DC jail and went on a hunger strike. Doctors force-fed her twice a day with a tube down her throat, a process that caused her to vomit repeatedly. The superintendent tried to find out if he could declare her mentally ill so that the forced feeding could stop, but she wasn't mentally ill at all. So less than a month after that, Hunkins and other picketing suffragists are sent to Occoquan. They demanded to be treated as political prisoners. But the prison superintendent told his guards to teach the women a lesson. A history writer, Sarah Pruitt, recounts, the guards dragged the women down the hall, threw them into dark, filthy cells. Lucy Barnes had her hands shackled to the top of a cell, forcing her to stand all night. The guards threatened her with a straitjacket and a buckle gag. Day, the future founder of the Catholic worker movement, was slammed down on the arm of an iron bench twice. Dora Lewis lost consciousness after her head was smashed into an iron bed. Alice Kosu, seeing Lewis's assault, suffered a heart attack and didn't get medical attention until the following day. The Washington Post and other newspapers covered the harsh treatment of the suffragists, and it became a national embarrassment. Public opinion shifted in their favor. In March 1918, the Washington, D.C. Court of Appeals ruled that all the suffragists' arrests were unconstitutional.
Yeah, so, I guess the last question we were going to address was, why do these women matter? And it's pretty easy to see why the women in Marga's book matter. They fought the hard fight and the good fight. And in many ways, the Madams fought much smaller fights, closer to home, but they mattered to the women that worked for them. They mattered to the communities. In part, one of the things that they did is kept single men in the West willing to work, because there were very few women, and they were some of the first women that came west. So if you were single and you wanted to have a dalliance of some sort, you pretty much went to the houses. So I was going to read just a little bit from the beginning where I actually talk about it, about why they mattered and what jobs they did. Idaho has a long history of strong, independent thinkers who embody the gritty and vital spirit of the West. During the gold and silver rushes of the 1800s, adventurous, hardworking men flocked to Idaho territory, many of them with grand dreams of striking it rich. Miners, railroad workers, loggers, and merchants made their money and were only too eager to spend it on alcohol, gambling, and pleasure. The women of vice who followed them west were happy to oblige. These madams and prostitutes also wanted to get rich, or at least make a livable wage and gather a small nest egg. The West was large and pocked with logging, mining, and railroad boom towns that popped up overnight and died out just as quickly once the trees or ore ran out or the railways extended down the west. The Madams extended down the line. Many prostitutes were bold, nervy women who made choices, sought adventure, exhibited business savvy, demanded respect, craved stability, and gained independence in a man's world. Some took care of their families through the trade, sending their siblings to school or paying medical bills. They either chose the frontier sex trade deliberately or came to it through a twist of fate. The Madams often came up through the ranks of prostitution. They helped manage transactions between the women and men who wanted them. According to Cynthia Powell in her dissertation, Beyond Molly Be Damned, Western women were constrained by the Victorian idea of the perfect woman. They were also freed by the strong, fierce, independent image of the wild, untamed frontier woman. Women were expected to be self-sufficient, to work hard, to take care of the land and build something. They were also expected to be sophisticated, demure, calm, and beautiful, all at once. This dichotomy of Victorian and frontier ideals sowed confusion and social friction in the mid to late 19th century, when prostitution was an acceptable part of frontier life. Then in the early 20th century, the public's view of prostitution shifted from that of a necessary vice to a social illness. Abolitionists, reformers, and social hygienists sought to stigmatize the trade or get rid of it altogether. She talks about how the bad women, in quotes, took care of the good women because they protected them from men's sexual urges. And then they also kind of took care of the good women by showing what they would have to look forward to if they didn't behave. So it was really quite a dichotomy, And then there's this little part that I want to read back here, which is, it happened in Boise City with Dixie Lawrence's house, and two of her women got into a fight, and one of them stabbed the other, and And in the meantime, someone was passed out. And it was later in this, it was like in the early 1900s where the reformers were trying to abolish prostitution, and women were having to be hidden, and it wasn't supposed to be happening as much. There was more illegality to it. So when this incident happened, Dixie, the madam, she would have been multitasking like crazy. She likely had to soothe the two women, clean up the mess, call the doctor, and deal with the police. She would have had to calm the other customers in the building and do what she could do to preserve their reputation for maintaining a safe and enjoyable parlor house. As a businesswoman, Dixie not only had to deal with leases, landlords, and providing a suitable and comfortable home, she also had to apply for liquor licenses and hire domestic servants, cooks, servers, bartenders, and musicians. She had to purchase food and supplies, run interference with law enforcement, curry favor with politicians, weather reform movements, and raise bail for the arrests of herself and the women working for her. She had to deal with difficult customers, entertain politicians and lobbyists, and keep a good reputation. She had to soothe bruised egos and cool hot heads. She had to teach her women how to talk to men, ask for money, inspect them for disease. She had to do her best to protect the women who worked for her. She had to prop them up when they were down. She had to keep goodwill between them and watch for suicidal tendencies. When all that failed, as it would now and then, fights broke out and women attempted suicide. And then she had to counsel the women, call in the doctor, bury the dead, and pick up the remaining pieces.
I have other passages I can read, but I'm a little bit more curious to hear about if there's anything that struck your curiosity or people you want to know more about. So, any thoughts? Yes?
I would like to know what happened to the lawsuits.
Oh, the lawsuits. Good question. Hazel, Elouise won, and I do want to read the conclusion because when they were in the court cases, it was determined that probably the federal government owed close to at least $147 billion to American Indian tribes for. Basically, they had no accounting system for what they had done with the tribal accounts. And Elouise didn't know that until she suspected it from the stories she'd heard when she was growing up. But when she became the treasurer, what really alarmed her is the government was supposed to be investing monies that tribal land had earned from leases. And she was told, when she looked at the spreadsheet, there was negative earnings. And when she confronted the government officials, they insulted her and said she didn't know how to read a spreadsheet. And so she began to consult with other tribes across the country, and they had run into the same problems. So let me put on my glasses and I'll read the conclusion of what happened with the suit. And I thought it was pretty amazing that somebody like Elouise Cobell came along and decided of all things to become a bookkeeper. I mean, thank God. So for more than 100 years, the BIA had been collecting royalties on Indian lands and putting them in a general fund instead of in proper individual accounts. And the money had then been used by the government for various purposes, which they had not kept track of. And in fact, what was really stunning to find out is in the midst of a trial, the U.S. government was burning up the records, over 100 boxes of records. And this is while Babbitt, who I always thought was a good guy, was at the head of the Interior. I was absolutely shocked. So on June 10th, they filed suit, originally for 300,000 individual tribal members. That number was going to swell to 500,000. Cobell case is about saying no longer will we tolerate this abuse. And she admitted that when she was in Washington getting ready to file this suit, she was absolutely terrified. And you never would guess she was absolutely terrified, because when you watch film clips of her, she is so calm. She is so steady. She is just, it's just impressive. And I want to read just one thing that a judge said, and then I want to tell you what happened with the suit. The entire record in this case tells the dreary story of Interior's degenerate tenure as trustee delegate for the Indian Trust, wrote the judge, describing it as a short story shot through with bureaucratic blunders, flubs, goofs, foul-ups, and peppered with scandals, deception, dirty tricks, and outright villainy, the end of which is nowhere in sight. So, Cobell had estimated the government owed them $47 billion, but accountants with expertise in natural resources values placed it at $176 billion. So it's a bit of a shock that in December 2009, Cobell and her attorneys reached a $3.4 billion settlement. It was the largest monetary award for any class action suit ever brought against the U.S. government. And then it talks about how this was dispersed. But a number of reasons that she made this decision is every time she came up, the U.S. government had endless numbers of attorneys. She talked about, like, they could just pull out 100 attorneys. Court appearance after court appearance, more attorneys. What she really wanted not only was the money, because a number of these 300, now 500,000 people were elderly, and they were dying, and they didn't have a cent. But the other thing was that a key part of her lawsuit was she wanted an accounting system. She couldn't believe that the U.S. government, when she was an accountant, that the U.S. government could get away with absolutely no accounting system. So that was a key part of the settlement. And she said in a statement at the time, "We have achieved a measure of justice and financial compensation for individual Indians whose trust accounts were mismanaged by our government. Indians did not receive the full financial settlement they deserved, but we achieved the best settlement we could. This is a bittersweet victory at best, but it will mean a great deal to the tens of thousands of impoverished Indians entitled to share in its financial fruits, as well as the Indian youth whose dreams for a better life, including the possibility of one day attending college, can now be realized." So part of the settlement set up a college fund, and part of the settlement set up money to buy back pieces of tribal land to try and make reservations whole again. And so it took a couple years after the settlement for the checks to go out. They began to be called the Elouise checks. Cobell never got any money. She died of cancer several months before the checks were ever mailed. At her death, and I think part of the reason for her settlement was that President Barack Obama was there. And if you remember in my first reading, there had been 4 different Department of Interior secretaries. This could go on endlessly. This could have gone on, depending on who was in office, hundreds of years. Obama thought this was just an embarrassment, that this suit had not been settled, and he called it a stain on the nation. He awarded Cobell the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously in 2016. And this is some quotes that include John Tester and Tom Cole of Oklahoma. "Without Elouise Cobell's tenacity, it is certain that neither compensation nor any recognition of misdeeds would have been forthcoming with the London Telegraph. Senator John Tester echoed that sentiment, saying, "There's no doubt in my mind this would not have happened without someone like Elouise Cobell." I never started this case with any intentions of being a hero, Cobell said in 2000 after the settlement was reached. "I just wanted the case to give justice to people that didn't have it." U.S. Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma said, "We're going to be talking about Elouise Cobell the way we talk about Rosa Parks 50 years from now. She's a great American who stood up for the rights for people, and in doing that, expands the rights for all Americans." So she did win. What a fight. Yes? I'm sorry. Yes, you.
You were talking about the fact that this was lease money that they were trying to obtain. What about all the money they lost because they sold off parcels of the reservations? And at least the Indians I've spoken to say, "Oh yeah, our piece of land went up the side of a mountain. You couldn't do anything with it. But the middle of the valley went to a ranch."
Yeah, and part of that's explained here about what happened with the Dawes Act. I didn't want to read that background because it's a little bit messy, but that's how reservations got broken up, and that's why part of the settlement was to set aside funds so that they could begin to buy back from willing people parcels to start making reservations whole again. Yes?
Was there a significant number of prostitutes who would end up marrying any of these single men you talked about?
It's a good question. I didn't run across much information that said that happened. I'm sure it probably did happen. More what seemed to happen is that the women sort of slid down the hierarchy of prostitution. So, the safest place was to be like a mistress or a kept woman, then the parlor houses and bordellos, and then the brothels, and then the cribs, which were just little, rooms in an alley, then the streetwalker, and then what they called the hog ranch, which was where the women went when they were sort of washed up and or sick. So I didn't run across a lot of information that said they married, although it probably did happen because there were not that many women, in the early West. So, yeah.
Your book,
Copper Sky?
that's based on a woman that does get out of, it doesn't.
Yes, and well, it's fiction. It is fiction, but it is just sort of the way that the story went. It's not based on a true character. Yeah, but I'm sure there were women that married, but I didn't. I guess because of the study, what I researched, I didn't run across much of that.
Wouldn't they too, once they got married, they wouldn't want the advertising. They were a
Yeah, they would have. And there's Polly Bemis in Idaho, and she was won in a poker game, right? But the man that won her, treated her well, and she treated him well. And when he died, she got the land, which was, again, something unusual. They married, and the community rallied around her and took care of her. And then there are women that were had lifelong partners, like Louise Beaver, the woman on the front here. She lived with a man for most of her adult life, but when he died, his obituary never mentioned her. So they weren't. Pardon?
Depends who writes it.
The obituary, yeah. So that one she wasn't mentioned in. So. So they did find partners, but it wasn't. I don't know that it was necessarily from the sex trade, but I'm sure it probably did. Some did.
Yeah. In your research, have you found a distinct power struggle between the sexes for control over the sex trade? given the loss of control that the women had over history to men, was that coincidence, or did you find
Will you say it again?
how control women had over the sex trade, how it over time went to men? Did you find intention behind that, or is it truly coincidence?
Well, what happened is when the reformers came in, right, they had good intentions, but they pushed the women behind fences and into the hands of the men, basically. So then the fines were bigger, rent was bigger, they had a harder time owning land, so they kind of pushed, the reformers had good intentions, and they were sort of like seeing the women as victims, and so they were trying to get them, they wanted to shut down the sex trade, but the women had nowhere to go. You know, it wasn't so easy for them to just go out and find a job. So that's sort of what happened. I don't know that it was intentional necessarily, but once it went that way, then, you know, the disreputable men and the saloon owners, then they charged them more, and then as they started to take control of it, it got a lot more violent, and women had less agency over their lives, the prostitutes and madams did. Yeah.
Were there any things that most surprised you in your research?
I guess I didn't really understand how much the madams did for the community and for the women that worked for them. Like Dolores Arnold in Wallace. Of course, everybody said go to Wallace when I said I was doing this. And in 1972, during the Sunshine Mine accident, she sent food baskets to all of the families of the 91 miners that died in that accident. She bought football jerseys. You know, they all they donated to charities. They donated to the raffles, and then gave the money back. So those sorts of things, I didn't realize how much they actually did. Yeah.
Were there any other questions?
I have a question for you. How many people were you able to interview in person out of the 10 that you talked about?
I didn't get to interview, I mean, my people are dead. So, but I did interview, Minnie Two Shoes, I interviewed, she's a really flamboyant, interesting journalist. And she and Paul DeMaine wound up finding out who had killed Annie Mae Aquash, who was a young AIM activist. I did interview Paul, and I'm looking back over my people. I interviewed people who had researched, like Kevin Kustra, who knew about Hazel Hunkins. But a lot of my people, there was not a direct trail to somebody who would have known their story, and so it's pieced together from newspaper articles. I did start with the Historical Society, and I have some historians I've always bugged for my job, so I stopped in and told them my idea of what I wanted to write, and they told me about interesting people who they thought deserved more attention and gave me some ideas of where to begin. But yeah, I'm just flipping through here to see for the most part, the next phase, which I would have loved to do, was to do something more in depth and actually start digging in to find ancestors. And some people I found some really great quotes in newspapers, but other people, there's just not much of a written record. So trying to have them come to life. I did Octavia Bridgewater. I did her great niece and great nephew. They grew up and hung out with her a lot. And so they knew about her personality traits and things like that. But there were a bunch of things they had no idea about her history, and it's kind of amazing is Octavia and her mom collected so much about Black history in Helena and in Montana. They had something, how many boxes? They had 30, 60 boxes of documents that they donated to the Smithsonian. It's one of the largest collections on Black American from frontier times on. And it's really valuable because while they were collecting this information, this was a time also when there were 3 major Black newspapers, like in Helena. They all folded. So much of the history of this time is in, like, their family archives, so I didn't get a chance to go to Washington and dive into the 60 boxes, unfortunately. But I did, the timing was perfect that this woman who was working on her PhD did dive in to those boxes, and she sent me a thesis chapter that she was working on that told me a lot of the history. And it's only then that I found out I had initially been looking into Octavia, and I didn't know she really met my criteria, because I was trying to look for people who really changed history and also took a lot of grief. And then I found out by reading the thesis piece that, yes, she had taken a lot of grief, and she had definitely been faced a lot of prejudice. But there was so much about that even her family didn't know. Was it? I'm sorry, yes?
First, I'd like to thank you on the left, I'm not sure how to say your names, for centering so many other than white heroes. I think often that is given a separate space as opposed to in the whole, and I appreciate that. And then I'm also curious to know whether you found in your research on prostitution the presence or not at that time of either immigrant women, a lot of Japanese and Chinese people who came over either as brides or as railroad workers, as well as indigenous women, and what their roles or absence meant.
Yeah, the Chinese women or girls, you would say, they were imported. They had no choice. They're an example of where the women didn't make any choice whatsoever. They were imported and kept in cages and farmed out, and they were threatened with Idaho and Montana because they knew that they might just be used relentlessly until they died. They sometimes were imported at 11 years old and maybe died by the time they were 20. Donna Linda Cameron was tried to rescue those Chinese girls, and there is a good book. I cannot remember the name of the author, but the book is called Daughters of the White Devil. And some of the women she rescued, one of them was like graduated from Sanford, so they went to college. They actually ended up having some lives, but a lot of them died as a result of it. And maybe because it's Idaho, it's fairly homogenous or whatever the word is, that's pretty white, maybe because of that. So, but the Chinese women was the saddest story that I came across. Yeah.
Last year at the book festival, I heard someone talking about this, and actually, during the Chinese Exclusion Act, no Chinese women could immigrate to the United States except prostitutes.
Wow.
So they were trying to import that commodity.
Right.
Because they had Chinese male workers that they wanted to accommodate.
Wow. Did you guys hear that back there? Yeah, that's pretty sad.
But it's interesting, too, because there's a historian at the Montana Historical Society. She's retired now, but Ellen Baumler. But she said that that automatically in census, it was assumed any Chinese woman was a prostitute, even though a number of them were not, but it was very hard for Chinese women to get into this country. And so, yeah. But I find it intriguing is it was just automatically assumed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was there any other questions?
When I volunteered in Dark Jonestown, the man who ran the man who ran that store, the store for everything back then, that he lived with a Chinese woman for pretty much his whole career there. And she was reported as a prostitute, obviously, in the census, but it's very likely his wife, his partner, had to be considered a prostitute.
Which is kind of seems strange to me because often in the census, prostitutes weren't even identified as prostitutes. They were identified as housekeepers and seamstresses. And so, I didn't realize that if they were Chinese that they had to be identified as a prostitute. That's, because a lot of times no one else was.
I think it's time for us to wrap up, but I think we can meet you outside, but they probably have a use for this room.
Thank you all so much.
Thank-
I caught the tail end of that. And,
Thank you.
and I also would be remiss not to Country Press for sponsoring this event in particular. So thank you so much, both of you.
Yes, thank you.